Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Insights and Innovation series. It's amazing to have everyone with us. And today we've got our very, very good partners, ARN, talking to us. We've got the amazing Sally, who's dialing in from Melbourne. She's going to be introducing Dr. Shannon Bosshard, and I just mentioned possibly my favourite name in all the medical world. But Dr. Shannon is going to be talking through ARN's the sound connection presentation and ARN's Neurolab. And it's basically exploring audiences and the way they connect with brands in the post-COVID world. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sally to run things, and I'll keep my big mouth quiet.
A huge welcome to everyone and all the IMAA members today. The fantastic work that the IMAA do for all its members is phenomenal, and the growth has been fantastic in the last 12 months. So a welcome to a variety of agencies across Australia representing some of the biggest brands that we work with. Today, we are going to take you through a small part of the connections that count for ARN. And it is a small part, but it's becoming very much an integral part of the way that we find solutions for our clients with digital audio. A sound connection will be presented by our very own in-house neuroscientist, Dr. Shannon Bosshard, and he will take you through all the things that make up our audio, our solutions that we provide to our clients. So without any further ado, over to Shannon, and enjoy the session, everyone.
Thank you for having me, everybody. I'm going to present, hopefully this works fine. I'll just present my entire screen. If anybody can't see audio, then please let me know. But welcome, and thank you again for having me. So like Sally said, I'm going to talk to you about the most recent piece of research that we've done, which is obviously a sound connection. And the purpose of this research was to sit somewhere between a sound you can see, which was our last piece that we've gone to market with, and the piece that we currently have in market, which was a connection that counts. And again, the purpose of this is to demonstrate, I suppose, the efficacy of audio in amongst our audio campaigns, but also our audio visual campaigns. And so what I want to do first is talk to you a little bit about how audio functions as a connective piece when it comes to building brands with your consumer. And we're connected in every aspect of our lives. We're connected at a neuronal level, we are connected at a familial level, we're connected at communal levels, and then of course now with technology being the way that it is, we're connected at a global level. And this is only going to continue to increase. The propensity at which we use these technologies and these interfaces to connect with those around us and connect with our environment is only going to grow exponentially. And so the reason that we do this is that connections effectively provide us with meanings. And so this video actually has no audio, so don't be alarmed if you can't hear anything. What I generally ask you to do is have a look at the video and interpret the interactions that these shapes are having. And generally what you find is that people will say, well, it looks like that larger triangle is chasing those two smaller shapes around, and those two smaller shapes appear to be fearful. But you can start to see that using objects that have no innate meaning, we're really, really good at creating meaning, right? That is the function of the brain, is to decipher the information that comes in via the environment and then interpret that and provide it with meaning, even when things have no meaning. And so what this means and what this provides insight into is the fact that we generally use our past to assign meaning to either the present or the future. And so there are many, many examples of this. One of the most common is that of seafood. So for the most part, people enjoy seafood, but it really only takes one interaction with seafood in a negative manner for it to influence the way that we interact with it going forward. So food poisoning once changes the way that we then consume that food. When we think about animals, for the most part, people don't necessarily have an aversion to dogs or cats, but it only takes one negative interaction to change the way that we perceive those animals going forward. And this is exactly the same with brands. So our interactions with brands dictate how we then interact with them going forward. And this is really, really important because it sheds light on some other questions. So how quickly or how deeply can we build these new associations? And how do we do that? If we take those brands on the left-hand side, so brands like McDonald's, TikTok, Facebook, brands that everybody is obviously very, very familiar with, consumers tend to adopt associations with those products very, very quickly. and so it doesn't necessarily take very long to build those associations. But then when we have a look at brands on the right hand side, and I've picked BMW and Mercedes, these are obviously considered to be luxury items, but you could take almost any automotive brand where it takes, recognizably longer to build those associations between the brand and the consumer. Mercedes and BMW have often said, it requires almost a lifetime of interaction with the consumer to bridge that gap between their brand message and what the consumer is thinking and feeling. And this is really important because as a consumer, as a human, we tend to rely on, or we tend to focus more on negative associations than we do positive associations. And so if you take a brand like Mercedes or like BMW, where you are required to build it across a lifetime, how do you mitigate the possibility, or how do you mitigate the negative associations that consumers can possibly have over that really, really long time? And one of the ways is obviously to use audio. So audio within an academic perspective, or from an academic perspective and from a commercial perspective, has demonstrated repeatedly that it's fantastic when it comes to mitigating those negative impacts. So research has demonstrated that there's a 65% chance that you can modify your consumer's mood in a positive way by incorporating sounds in their environment. Things like changing the way that we perceive our food, so sonic perception. You can look at things like motivation, so including music in your environment increases the propensity at which people engage in riskier decisions. Even changing their consideration, so you can modify the brands that are selected by consumers by incorporating different music. And then lastly, something that is obviously well established and well known is that you can change consumers' actions, particularly within retail stores, and increase those sales anywhere between 10 and 40%. So these are really good examples of, I suppose, the power that audio has when it comes to building those connections with your consumer. Now, the reason that audio is such a powerful medium is that, first and foremost, we have a really unique relationship with audio. So audio is one of the first senses that we use to establish connections with our environment. So before we're even born, we familiarize ourselves with our parents' voices, with environmental noises. Many parents play music whilst their baby's in the womb. And so again, you can see here at the very beginning, before we're even born, music plays a fundamental aspect in how we connect with our environment. As we grow older and as we start to go through our work lives, we use music as a way of changing our emotions. And then as we get older, we are one of the only species, if not the only species, that lives well beyond their reproductive years. And the reason for that is so that we can pass on cultural knowledge. And the way that we do that primarily is via our voice. So we communicate, we pass on that information. And again, you can see that over our entire lifespan, it's audio that plays a really fundamental role in passing on that knowledge. Now that I guess you've got a bit of an understanding of why connections are so important from a consumer point of view, and I suppose the inclination for us, or the possibility of using audio to strengthen those connections, the three things that I'm going to take you through today. The first is getting the most out of your creative. So looking at how you can build stronger connections at a creative level. The second thing is increasing campaign effectiveness. So primarily using audio and audio visual mediums to capitalize on the connections, or the strength of the connections that you can build. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about using audio as a part of a long-term growth strategy for your brand. Now, if anybody has any questions, I implore you to ask as I go through. Otherwise, I kind of have a tendency to just continue to speak. So if there's any comments or questions, I'd rather that this be more of an interactive piece than me just speaking at you. The first thing I'll do is I'll talk about the methodology. So how did we conduct the research? So if you guys have been exposed, if you guys were exposed to a sound that you could see, it follows very, very similar train of thought, where we had participants undergo a number of different tasks. The first was looking at TV and radio. So how did those two mediums interact with one another? What are the benefits of each of those? And does it necessarily matter whether you introduce your brand on one of those mediums before the other? Then we looked at the impact that musical undertones have in an ad. So if you remove the voice, what impact does the audio have, or the audio backtrack? If you remove that musical backtrack, what impact does the voice have, and so forth. And so we could start to pick apart the nuances of those ads. Then we looked at sonic branding. So we tested about 60 different brands and had a look at how their sonic brands and what actually contributes to a good sonic brand. And lastly, we had them look at listen to a block of ads. And so that's pretty typical for the type of research that we do, so that we can start benchmarking how all of the content that we test actually performs against other content. And so if you're unfamiliar with what the Neurolab does, I won't spend too much time on this slide, but we use it primarily in two main ways. We use it to predict the likelihood that a piece of content or a design or a web page or a brand, how likely that is going to perform well in market before it actually goes to market. And the other way that we use it is diagnostically. So understanding whether how a piece of content performs with another piece of content, or again, comparing two designs or whatever the case might be. And they're the two ways that we use the technology. What do we measure? So we measure, you can see here, we measure about 6 different metrics, but the 4 that I focus on primarily are those that come directly from the brain. The first is attention. So how much information is the brain processing at any one given time? Is the consumer actually processing your brand message? We look at engagement. Are people in an engaged state? Are they receptive? Is the brain in an alert state? We look at attitude. So are people liking what you're presenting them, or are they disliking it? And then lastly, we look at memory. So are they encoding information into memory, or are they retrieving existing information if it's a brand with which they should already be familiar? Now, the first piece that I'll talk about is getting the most out of your creative. And I consider audio to be the low-hanging fruit. And I guess we'll talk a little bit about why. But emotions are the basis of our behavior. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at academic research or commercial research or psychology research, it all points to this really, really important factor, and that is emotion. If you can build an emotional connection with your consumer, they're far more likely to act on that information than they are if you provide them with factual information. And that's something that is well established. Now, there are obviously a number of ways that you can elicit these emotional responses, but I think from a brand's perspective, it's considerably easier to elicit an emotional response from a visual point of view. And this is where a lot of brands do particularly well. So take Nike, for example, with their celebrity endorsements. Brands like Cadbury have done a fantastic job of, monetizing the color purple or the italicized font. Now, what brands I think have forgotten to do, or not necessarily forgotten, but have considerably less knowledge about, or the word I'm looking for, I've missed. But what brands have, I guess, forgotten to do a little bit is understand the importance of audio and the versatility of audio. And so I'm not sure, I'm hoping that this plays with audio, but we'll see. Did everybody hear that? Did somebody hear that?
All good. All good.
All good. Excellent. Fantastic. So that's obviously Baker's delight. And so regardless of the association that you have personally, you can tell that the association is quite different than that of something like this. Right, so this is obviously Spotlight. And again, the association that you have with that is very different than something like this. Right, which is obviously the good guys. And I think a lot of brands understand the importance of audio from a musical point of view, but what is often neglected is the fact that audio is significantly more versatile. So things like utilizing a consistent voice.
From the time I played God in the movies, people seem to confuse.
Right, that's obviously Morgan Freeman. And so there are quite a number of brands, well-established Australian brands, that have done this quite well. So CrimSafe is one of those where they've consistently used the Kimmy's voice, and when we've tested that in a lab, it's done quite well, and brands and consumers really resonate with that consistency from a vocal point of view. Something like sound effects, another really great way of captivating your audience in terms of really getting them engaged from the beginning of the ad is using obviously sound effects. Another way that audio is incredibly versatile. And then, of course, you have something like bespoke branding, where you have your jingle, you have your 2-second piece that really elicits that emotional response. And so when we talk about the creativity that brands often have when it comes to their visual components, there needs to be the same level of creativity assigned to the audio components of those ads. Now, when we look at audio in isolation, I think it's really easy to understand the importance of audio. And so this slide is really to demonstrate that audio still plays quite a significant role in how we perceive visual content as well. And so I've got here 2 examples for Sony Bravia. The Sony Bravia is obviously television, and this ad is quite old. And what I'll do is I'll first play an ad that is almost the original piece, and then I'll play the ad in its final form. Right, so that's the ad before the musical overlay is included, and now this is the final product.
One night to be confused, one night to speed up truth. We had a promise made.
Right, and you can see the ad is significantly more enjoyable. It's significantly easier to digest when that audio backtrack is included. And so again, it's a really clear demonstration that the way that you connect with your consumers, or the way that consumers connect with your brand message, is entirely different simply because of the use of audio. Now, we wanted to have a look at how to get the best out of your audio ads. And so from an audio perspective alone, this makes quite considerable amount of sense. But obviously, you can use these findings within your audio visual pieces as well. And so some of the things that we've done, so to date, we've tested approximately 250 different audio ads, quite a large number of television ads. And what we're starting to find are these trends. And so if you have a specific interest in having an ad broken down a specific way, maybe you're interested in, obviously on the left-hand side, you can see leveraging one voice over another. In this case, male or female, then we can break the data down like that. So if you guys have any interest in something that maybe I don't present here, but something that you are wondering from a creative point of view, what would happen if we did X or Y? If we have the data, I'd be more than happy to break that down for you and provide you an insight based on the ads that we've tested today. On the left-hand side, so like I was saying, you can see quite considerable differences between the way that consumers perceive female and male voices. When we look at neutral brands, so a neutral brand is a brand that we would consider to obviously not be male or female. So when we think about something like an automotive brand, we might consider that to be, generally speaking, more male-oriented than something like lingerie, which might be something more female-skewed. And so when we look at neutral brands or female-skewed brands, female voices perform significantly better across all of those metrics, and on average get about 15% more activity across all of those metrics that I talked about before. When we talk about conversational ads, we find that 2 voices perform significantly better than the inclusion of either 1, 3, or 4 voices. And now when I talk about ads that contain 2 voices, those 2 voices don't necessarily have to communicate with one another. It's often enough to have one voice introduce the product, have a second voice then talk about a different experience with the product. They don't actually have to be communicating with one another, but we generally find that 2 voices perform significantly better, and on average about 20% more effective than those ads that contain 1, 3, or 4. When we talk about talent, now again, this doesn't necessarily have to be the case within audio only. If you are utilizing talent within your podcasts or within your audio visual mediums, we would expect to find very similar results. But again, the fact that people have built a connection with that talent, we can see that particularly when we come to engagement, people are far more receptive to that information. And I've talked about that before. If you're discussing a topic at the water cooler at work and you are having a conversation with a work colleague, that you've built a relationship with, you're far more likely to consume that information than you would if it's somebody that you haven't built a relationship with that's telling you that. And so again, this is the same thing with talent. When we talk about ad lengths, we try to encourage our clients not to get caught up on the ad length. So we generally find that 15-second ads, 30-second ads are equally effective. And we tend to use this notion that good content is good content. If you have a good 30-second ad, you can equally make a good 15-second ad. And I guess the inverse is true. If you have a bad 30-second ad, it's likely to be a bad 15-second ad. And the last thing that we looked at and that we pulled apart was looking at how the environment actually influences the way that message is consumed. And we find that attitude changes or attitude increases by about 145%, regardless of the medium, when you get the message and the environment together. And I liken that to something like if you take a traditional television ad and you were to put it in Netflix, it's probably not going to be perceived as positively as if you were to take that television ad and place it in a television ad spot. And so again, really talking about the different ways that you can connect with your consumer, and these small changes effectively lead to quite significant wins when it comes to connecting with your consumer. And these are all something that you should take advantage of where possible. Now, again, I guess that's my summary slide. So small changes in audio creative can significantly enhance the way that people connect with your brand and your brand message. The next thing I'll talk about is increasing campaign effectiveness. And so this section is all about capitalizing on the unique strengths of each medium. And if you guys are familiar with the work that's been presented quite recently by Dr. Karen Nelson-Field, particularly in the realm of audio-visual, and primarily visual mediums, is this notion that the way that people consume media is very different. And so if you take $100,000 and you place it into television and you place it into Facebook and you place it into Instagram, equal amounts across all three of those, you get very different responses in terms of the way that consumer consume that information. And the idea is that attention differs across these mediums, right? And so whilst attention might differ, there are obviously other metrics that differ too. And so it's about understanding what each of these different mediums offer and how to best capitalize on those. So from TV's point of view, TV does a fantastic job of building long-term retention. When it comes to radio, it's about building engaging content, obviously memorable content, through this constantly or rapidly changing environment, obviously inclusive of talent. When we talk about digital advertising, it's all about being able to personalize that content. So whether that's within an online space or within an online audio space, it's all about being able to personalize that content to really get that cut through. When we talk about podcasting is obviously an environment that is conducive of memories, and that's what our research has demonstrated. And so if you're looking at really building memories associated with the brand, then podcasting is an excellent environment in which to do that. And lastly, music streaming. Music streaming is all about those positive emotions. So we obviously have this emotional connection with music, and it's able to change the way that we feel, change the way that we interact with brand messaging. And so once we understand that these all have unique propositions, then capitalizing on them becomes significantly easier. But when we look at it from a very basic point of view, we understand how consumers actually consume or interact with this content. What we generally find is that there is quite a large difference in terms of how people consume visual content and how consumers consume audio content. So it takes us about 1/20th of a second to judge a website design and its properties. It takes us about 1/10th of a second to judge a person's attractiveness, whether they're competent. It takes us 1/10th of a second to judge an item at a grocery store, but it takes us about 3 to 6 seconds to judge a piece of audio. Now, there's a number of reasons for that, and I'll talk about evolution for a little bit. So we've evolved in a way that has meant that when we consume audio, we have to store that audio or pieces of that audio into memory. And the reason for that is that if we are presented with something visual, let's just say a lion, right? You immediately know that that is a threat, right? If you hear a piece of audio, right? If you hear leaves crunching and you hear something walking towards you, you need to be able to piece that information together. One crunch is often not enough to know that something is in the bush, right? How big it is, whether it's moving towards you or away from you. And all of these things need to be stored somewhere in memory. And so what the brain has done is develop something called echoic memory, where it stores information for about 3 to 6 seconds. The second thing is that, generally speaking, when you see something, you often have the opportunity to look again, right? So if you pass an ad in the street, you can generally look again to see what that ad was for. If you're presented with an audio ad, you don't get the same opportunity. Actually, anything in terms of an audio, you don't get a second chance to perceive that. And so it's really important that you make sense of it the first time that you hear it. Now, what we've seen from a neuro point of view, so when we go into the lab and we have a look at how the brain distinguishes or how it processes audio content and audio visual content, we see that for the most part, across the board, the brain tends to allocate more resources to processing that audio than it does the audio visual content. And this seems to substantiate the slide that I was just talking about, is that the brain emphasizes or places more importance on processing that audio than it does the audio visual. Now, from an advertising point of view, what this really demonstrates is that, again, not only do consumers engage with this medium differently or process this medium differently, but the benefits of using it are obviously quite different, right? Consumers are required to create their own idea of what it is that they're being played, what it is that they're hearing. They have to create their own imagery in their mind. And when we have a look at that from a 30-second ad perspective, so we can take those ads and we can break it down and we can say what is happening at every second or every half a second that ad is being played. And what you can see is that there is really no difference at the beginning, right? For about the first 14 seconds, the way that the brain processes an audio ad is very similar to how it processes an audio visual ad. It's the last 15 seconds where we see that there is considerable drop-off from the amount of effort that the brain is allocating to storing, in this case, storing that information into memory when compared to the audio piece. And so there's obviously a number of reasons why this might happen. But what we tend to find, again, is that the brain tends to emphasize importance on things where it actively has to create its own imagery rather than, the audio visual information that's being spoon-fed. Now, when we have a look at the way in which we present the media, so if you present your client or your consumer with audio content, so they're primed with audio before they see that TVC or before they see that audio visual message, what impact does that have? Can we in some way make up for that loss that we saw in that previous slide? And what we tend to see is quite a significant difference. So you can see the audio visual content in the blue. And then you can see the audio visual, the same audio visual information after consumers have been primed with an audio message for the same brand. And so what you can see is we see that memory for that information is about 44% higher. And we see that attention for the information for that branding message is 61% higher. And I've highlighted the last section because this is about, and I'll refer to this later, but this is generally the position where about 77 or 70% of brands mention their brand name in the commercial. So this section is incredibly important. So if we can get uplift in that section, it really talks to the power of utilizing these mediums together. Now, one of the questions that we're often asked is, does it matter whether I'm using a call to action or a branding ad, and whether that has any impact on the way that consumers then consume subsequent information? And so, of course, what we did was we went back through all of the ads that we've tested and we've broken them down based on whether they were CTA or branding. And across the board, you can see that there's a slight increase across all of those metrics with response to CTA. And the reason for that is likely due to the fact that when you are presented with a CTA ad, there is a time limit that's associated with that. So come in this Friday at 1 o'clock, and as a result, the brain is required to remember that information. Branding ads are more holistic. There's no deadline attached to it. And so the brain doesn't have to work as hard or place as much importance on it as it does those CTA. But for the most part, you can see that they're much of a muchness. There's not a large difference. And so our take-home message would be, regardless of whether you're using CTA or branding ads, the impact that has on your subsequent audio visual content is positive. Now, there is obviously no doubt that campaigns are, for the most part, typically led by TV, and no doubt nothing that we say will change that. And so, of course, we wanted to have a look at the impact that television effectively has on your audio content. And what we find is that across the board, you get about a 30% increase on your radio during a TV campaign. So if you are presenting your information or your branding messages across both of those mediums within a relatively close time frame, you get considerable uplift in your radio because you've used an audio-visual medium. And I think this slide only serves the purpose of, I suppose, validating television and radio, and the two of them together. Audio, the last piece that I'll talk about is the fact that audio enhances outdoor messaging. So if you're unfamiliar with this slide, this is a slide that I've presented in the Sound You Can See piece. And what this demonstrates is the power of priming using audio. And so what we had participants do, we had two groups of participants drive through the city of Melbourne as a passenger in a vehicle. One of those groups had been primed with audio beforehand. So they listened to a radio segment with radio ads in it before being driven past this outdoor messaging. On the left-hand side, you can see eye tracking data. And you can see that people were significantly quicker to see things like the image on that outdoor message, the message on that outdoor ad, and the brand. Right? And that's simply using eye tracking. So people are much quicker to acknowledge the importance, or at least place more emphasis on the processing of that information after they've been primed with radio. On the right-hand side, we have the neuroprocessing. So this is, again, memory encoding. So how those areas that are associated with the storage of information into memory, how active were they whilst participants were going past that outdoor ad? And again, you can see that after having been primed with radio, people were about, the brain was about 79% higher in terms of its activity during those first 2 seconds, and 23% overall. So again, this real interesting finding that using these mediums together yields much better results than using them in isolation. And so what we would suggest that, our clients do is that obviously you would begin the campaign. I've used audio visual because that's the way that it's generally done. And then you would use audio not only as a way of increasing reach and frequency, but also increasing the metrics like attention and memories associated with that TVC. So you want to spoon feed your audience at the beginning in this case, and then you really want them thinking about your brand message. And audio does a great job of doing that. And then, of course, you would follow that with something like outdoor messaging, where you further enhance the memories associated with your brand message. And then lastly, obviously, you use audio to then bring them back into the store as your CTA. Now, again, using them in an overlapping sense yields significantly better results than staggering them out. And again, this is probably something with which you're already, familiar with. But the take-home message from that section is encourage effortful processing. So you want your consumer to think differently, to interact differently with those mediums. And so it's not just good enough to utilize one of them and then extend your campaign by staggering it out. You get far better effects when you encourage that processing all at once. The last piece, and again, I'll remind anybody, if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, like I said, I will just continue to speak. Does anybody have any questions or comments? No? Okay. The last section I'll talk about is investing in audio for future growth. And so before we look forward and look into the future of audio, I want to go back a little bit. And so anybody that's roughly 20 years older should be able to recite or at least remember some of these ads. And so what I want to do is I'm going to play snippets of ads where the brand names have actually been redacted. And so I just want you to have a think about whether or not you can remember these or whether you're familiar with them.
My dad used to prove to make the cordial that I like this.
That is obviously Coddy's, for those of you that didn't get it. I have another one.
30, 30, 32. For everything mechanical, we've got it.
Don't fix the car.
Welcome to 13, 30, 32.
That's 13, 30, 32.
So for those of you that one's slightly more difficult, I suppose, and I can hear my computer pinging, so I'm going to assume that somebody got it. I just can't see any of the messages. And if you don't recognize the audio, you'll remember the kid with the mullet. So that was obviously Lubemobile.
131166, 131166, 131166.
This is contentious. Their other number was 4911111. which was Pizza Hut. And then the last one goes for only a fraction of a second. And that is obviously aeroplane jelly. Now, I suppose what this slide is, the purpose of this slide is to demonstrate that, I suppose aeroplane jelly, first and foremost, that with less than a second's worth of audio, you can really conjure up emotions and memories associated with that brand. Right? And that is the potential that audio has in terms of building brands, particularly long-lasting brands. Now, we've seen over the last 100 years that the jingle has effectively died. For the most part, there are obviously brands that are still using it, but this was a response to brands needing to stay relevant, right? Brands, particularly in the 1980s, where Michael Jackson did a rendition of his Thriller song, I believe it was, for Pepsi. And it changed the way that brands utilized audio, right? There was this assumption that if I utilize pop music or the most recent music, it's going to increase the propensity at which people remember my brand and interact with my brand. And to a certain extent, that might be true. But what we're finding is that that might not actually be the case. We've seen that the world's biggest brands understand the importance of consistency. So if we look at something like McDonald's, we can see that McDonald's has used the same visual element for the last 60 years or thereabouts. And this is really, really important. Regardless of the brand, what we generally find is that there is at least some acknowledgement that they can't go changing logos. You can imagine that if a brand were to change their visual components as often as they change their auditory components, you would ask yourself the question, how is the consumer ever going to, or how are they ever supposed to remember who I am, what my brand message was, and what I've paired my brand with if you're constantly changing it? And now I use McDonald's quite a lot in my presentation because I think they've done a phenomenal job of building these connections from a neural point of view. So regardless of the sensory input, regardless of whether you think of McDonald's from a visual point of view or a smell point of view, a taste point of view, all of these demonstrate that McDonald's has done a fantastic job of keeping things consistent. Right? It's all about consistency. You know what you're going to get every time you walk into a McDonald's store. You know exactly what McDonald's is going to look like before you go into the store. And again, it's this notion that repetition really builds reputation. Now, from a neural point of view, the way that the brain connects those dots is really, really important. And again, I think I touched upon this very briefly in the first presentation that I gave. But regardless of your brand, regardless of who it is that you represent, it's really, really important that you have consistent audio, or not necessarily even audio, but consistent everything. So how the brain generally functions is that if you are presented with the McDonald's logo or any of those other logos, right, there is a part of your brain that becomes active when it's seen one of those logos, right? It's physically stored within your brain, like a storage closet, effectively. And every time you're presented with it, they become active. Now, the idea is that you want all of these different parts of the brain to become more active. So the more often that you are exposed to a visual element and an audio element, the stronger the connection between those two brain regions becomes, right? To the point where you have something that looks like this, right? The more often you have that interaction, the stronger that network becomes. And so the idea is that at some point your consumer will be exposed to something that's not necessarily your brand. They might be told the word salami, or they might be told the word tradies, or whatever the case might be. They might be told the brand an automotive dealership. All of these things conjure up an image, right? So for me, something like meat might conjure up something like Primo. For another consumer, where that connection is stronger, they might be thinking of a competing brand. And so your job is to strengthen those neural networks. So every time the consumer is exposed to something that may not necessarily be your brand, so they're presented with salami, they're immediately primed to think of Primo. And so this is effectively what happens if you don't utilize consistent audio. So again, I'm using McDonald's as an example, and you can imagine if McDonald's were to change their audio regularly, it would end up sounding, or the way that the brain looks it would end up looking something like this.
you're a tough guy, like it really rough guy, just can't get enough guy.
Is it loud enough? Cause my body is cold.
And so what you're starting to see is that the brain is still doing its job, and it's still building connections between all of the senses and the audio and the auditory cortex, right? The audio part of the brain. Excuse me. But what you see here is that those connections are significantly weaker than the ones we saw on the last page. And the impact that that has on your brand is that next time the consumer is exposed to one of those pieces of audio, the brain does the right thing, and it conjures up this desire to eat food, right? It does the job. It motivates the consumer to be hungry. But what happens is the consumer then doesn't remember which brand that piece of audio was tied to, and as a result of that, you then you're providing your consumer with opportunity, right? And you don't necessarily want to do that. You kind of want to mitigate that by strengthening those connections. And we've seen the impact that this has had on the consumer landscape. So you can see that consumers are significantly less likely now to have a favorite brand. And so this was a piece of research that was shared with me quite a while ago, and it came from 2015. And we've since replicated that, and you can see the results on the right-hand side. So we tested about 400 people, and we asked them, of all of these different brands, of all of these different industries, what's your favorite brand? Do you have one, and what is it? And you can see that for the top performing category, food and drinks, there's about 60% of people who claim to not have a favorite food and drink within that, or favorite brand within that category. And that should be really concerning for brands. When we look at that since 2007, that has fallen another 40%. So in the last 13 years or thereabouts, we've seen even more drop off since those initial results were published. And the reason that I say that this is concerning is that the way that we're going to consume, the way that we're going to consume information, the way that we're going to shop for brands and for products is going to rapidly change. At the moment, we see that about 42% of Australians are constantly or repeatedly using voice search to make purchases. On the right-hand side, the bar graph, you can see that that's the United States. And so you can see it sits about 20% higher. So generally, we look to the United States to have a look at trends. And this is again, quite concerning. You can see about 60% of people are regularly using voice assistant to make a purchase. Now, what this is going to do is it means that consumers aren't necessarily going to ask for your brand by name anymore. They're going to ask their phone or ask their fridge to purchase them new milk, or to purchase them new meats, or whatever the case might be. And what's going to happen is those pieces of technology are going to do what they do best, and they're going to generally order from those that have spent the most money to optimize themselves in terms of voice search. But for brands that don't have that money, what are the consequences? What if there is another brand that is that can spend more money, that can be the number one? And this is, I guess, a good demonstration here of how that will appear. So this is an example of how people are going to interact with their technology.
Let's say you want to ask Google to make you a haircut appointment on Tuesday between 10 and noon. What happens is the Google Assistant makes the call seamlessly in the background for you. So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
How can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a woman's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do.
Right, so you get the idea. So that's how consumers are going to interact with brands, right? There's generally in that example, there was no brand mentioned, and that was a hair salon. The interactions that consumers have with everyday goods or fast-moving consumer goods is going to be obviously significantly easier than that. And so if you have a brand that isn't being asked for by name now, then it's something that you really should be working on. And audio plays a significant role in building those memories from a branding perspective. Now, we wanted to have a look at how a brand or the impact that using consistent audio actually has on the perception of that branding message. And what we find is that the brain tends to prefer music, right? Regardless of the type of music. If we look at ads that contain no music and we compare those with ads that contain unfamiliar music, there's an inclination for the brain to prefer those musical components or those musical ads. Now, what's considerably more interesting is the fact that sonic audio or bespoke audio across the most important metrics, so is it something that is liked? Does the brain prefer it? And is it allocating more resources to storing that information into memory and retrieving existing information? Across all of those three metrics, we see that bespoke audio or sonic audio performs significantly better than those other two, either no music or unfamiliar music. Now, what's also, I think, really important, and obviously one that we wouldn't neglect to mention, is famous music. Now, at first glance, this obviously conjures up the notion that famous music does significantly better across all of those metrics, and therefore we should be applying it in every possible way that we can. But the question that is left is, whilst these metrics demonstrate that famous music performs better across each of these metrics, is there a transfer effect from the music to the brand, or do consumers leave remembering the music because they've already created associations with the music? And research demonstrates that it's probably the latter. It's really hard for consumers to learn something new about something that they've already learned something about. That was a really a weird sentence, but it makes sense. If you've learned something already, in this case, if you've learnt to like this piece of music, every time you hear that piece of music, you're learning something more about the music and not necessarily the branding message that's tied to it. And I think this is really, really important for brands to understand, is that, that they each serve a different purpose. When we look at a 30-second commercial and we break it down and we see how the brain processes the different musical components, what we see is that bespoke music and famous music again perform significantly better than either having no music or some form of non-famous music. But where it's really important, I said I would mention this again, during the last 10 seconds or so, which is where about 66%, so nearly 70% of ads mention their brand name in these last 10 seconds, we don't see any significant difference between the bespoke music and the famous music. And this is really, really important, because as a brand, if you are asked during the last 10 seconds of your commercial, if it doesn't affect the way that consumers perceive your branding message negatively, you can tie it to either bespoke music or famous music, and it doesn't make a difference, then logic would say I would want to pair that with bespoke music, something that is always paired with my brand if it doesn't, if it comes at no detriment to how consumers are perceiving that message. And this is really, really important. And so again, really demonstrates the power that bespoke music has. Now, there are 4 key ingredients to creating really strong audio. And again, I really want you to take note that repetition builds reputation. So when we're thinking about audio, we have to think about long-term. We have to think about lifetime. When we're talking about using audio in a consistent manner, we're not talking about using necessarily the same audio just within your ads per se. We're talking about using similar tones within your stores, within the lobby, maybe on your website, maybe in terms of hold music. So brands like MasterCard have done quite a good job of doing exactly this, where everywhere you see MasterCard, they have the same sonic trigger everywhere, right? To the point where when you sometimes use your MasterCard, it makes that noise at the terminal. Using music and understanding its purpose. So famous music is fantastic for those short-term connections. So when we looked at that 30-second graph, you can see that the first 20 seconds, famous music does a fantastic job of really engaging the consumer, building up momentum for the ad, so that when you get to the ad, you can use that bespoke audio to really drive home your long-term branding message or associations with your brand. And then, of course, lastly, using bespoke audio and aligning it with your brand consistently. So when we tested those sonic triggers or those bespoke pieces of audio, the most important thing is to contain the name of your brand name. So now I'm talking about a 2-second piece. It's really, really important that you contain your brand name within that sonic piece. And the rest of those are obviously important, but obviously comes secondary to including your brand name in your bespoke audio. And so the summary for this last section was that audio is an incredibly effective means of building brands. And it's really important that we understand the role of audio and try to reintroduce not necessarily the classic old style jingle, but consistent audio and aligning it with our brands. So there are obviously 3 things that you should take home from today's presentation. The first is that audio is a low-hanging fruit. So it acts as a relatively cheap and effective means of building those really strong connections with consumer. You can make those small changes to elicit quite significant results. TV, radio, and outdoor work really well together. So rather than staggering out your campaigns, we would really encourage you to utilize those mediums synchronously, or simultaneously, across all of those different mediums. And then, of course, lastly, repetition builds reputation. So consistent audio appears to be really, really fundamental driver of connections, particularly long-term connections with your brand. That is everything that I have for you guys. Thank you so much for your time. Does anybody have any questions or comments or feedback, anything at all? Has to be at least one.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, sometimes the guys are a bit quiet, but I think
this is the issue with teams.
Shannon, thank you so much. Sorry, thank you so much for that, mate. That was really, really interesting, and probably one of our more interesting presentations. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much. We'll circulate this video stuff to the members that missed it. Thank you, ARN, for your support and for putting this on today. Great job. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Next week, we've got next year, it's the IMAA, and we're going to be presenting the Pulse survey. We're going to be presenting the year in review, and someone's going to win a iPhone or iWatch 7, I think we're winning, who participated in the survey. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great week, and I'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you, guys. If anybody has